Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me my guest, a legendary author, speaker, best-selling author of emotional intelligence, now a new book called Why We Meditate, Daniel Goleman. Daniel, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here. Really is.
So, Daniel, you are obviously widely known as the father of the term emotional intelligence. You wrote that classic book,
Right.
as I understand, in the late 90s.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you've talked about it a million times, but tell me, when you kind of reflect on it now, now we're talking, 20, 25 years later, what is kind of your view on, how much it has proliferated our society and culture and business? And I mean, people
Right.
talk about EQ now in the same breath as IQ,
Sure.
Did you ever imagine the effect and the penetration of the term emotional intelligence when you wrote that book?
Richard, when I wrote that book, I was a science journalist at the New York Times. And it was in my duties as a science journalist that I happened upon a very obscure article called Emotional Intelligence, which was written by a guy named Peter Salovey, who was a young psychologist at Yale then, now the president of Yale University, and his then graduate student, Jack Mayer. And I thought, wow, that's a great phrase because it sounds so counterintuitive. Putting intelligence together with emotions instead of as antagonists. And I think it means being intelligent about emotions. So I went back to my own psychology past and I looked at it through the lens of new neuroscience, and I realized that it makes a lot of sense. It's being self-aware and using that self-awareness to manage our disruptive emotions so we can focus on what's important to us, marshaling the positive emotions, tuning into other people with empathy, knowing what they're feeling, because they're not going to tell us in words. Nobody tells you in words. They tell you in facial expression, tone of voice, and putting that all together to have skilled relationships, effective relationships. That's how I think about emotional intelligence. And I had no idea it would hit such a nerve globally, but it became a bestseller in many countries. And now I'm circling back. I'm just finishing a new book, Richard, which looks at 25 years of research. When I started with emotional intelligence, it was a little bit speculative. There weren't a lot of studies. I was piecing together, from different areas, the idea, but now it's very clear, very strong evidence that emotional intelligence makes someone an outstanding performer individually, a much more effective leader. It makes teams more productive, high performing. And I'm looking at what it would mean to have a emotionally intelligent organization, a company that's emotionally intelligent, for example. It's kind of completing the circle for me to look at all that data after all these decades.
Are you shocked or surprised by how much how much that has just taken off and how much it's now studied and widely used and penetrated into the common vernacular? I mean, everyone uses that term EQ now.
Yeah, I know. When I wrote the book, I thought, if I overhear two strangers using the word emotional intelligence, and they both know what it means, I'll have succeeded. So this is way beyond expectation. I had no idea. But it's kind of gone viral before
that
was the thing.
Right. And it's also something that is penetrated both personal lives and business, right? I mean, obviously it's just as important in personal interrelationships as it is in business and relationships.
Sure.
Can you comment on that a little bit? Is it more important in one than
that doesn't surprise me at all. The brain doesn't make a distinction between your work and your life.
Right.
It uses the same circuitry for everything. And emotional intelligence, think about it, you could be really smart, IQ smart, and have a series of failed romantic relationships. Because you're an emotional idiot. And, we all know people like that. But, the nice thing about emotional intelligence is it's learnable at any point in life. People can improve at any point in life if they're motivated.
Yeah, yeah.
And IQ, I'm not sure that you can change your IQ that much.
Well, when you read that article, what did it touch some personal things? I mean, why did it
Oh,
resonate with you so much? Tell me a little bit about,
uh,
what made what made those things kind of leap out at you?
well, I'm the child of professors. My father was a professor of humanities and very interested. He taught a course called The Autobiography of Civilization, which was looking at world literature in terms, and it turns out that reading novels, reading literature increases empathy.
Hmm.
You understand the emotional reality of someone else.
Oh, that's
And
interesting.
my mother was a social worker, so you put that together. I always had been interested in, I actually got a doctorate in clinical psychology. I was always interested in the
Hmm.
emotional side of life. But on the other hand, you know, I was very competitive in school, and I went to hard to get into places, shall I say,
Hmm.
for college and university and so on.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I was with a lot of high IQ people, and I thought that there was a blind spot in academics. And
Hmm.
that had to do with the importance of being able to manage your own emotions and emotions in relationships.
Hmm.
So when
Hmm.
I saw that idea of emotional intelligence, being intelligent about emotion, I thought, aha, this is important.
Hmm. Hmm. When at the time you read that article, did you think you yourself had a pretty high EQ? I mean, what would you say about yourself?
No, you have to ask my wife that question. You know, and I think it depends on the day.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Well, what have you learned about EQ? I mean, you've obviously written a ton about it, but
mm,
share some of the insights that you really learned about it that, maybe not everyone is sort of aware.
well, two things I think are important and maybe under little known. One is that your ability to handle yourself and be self-aware depends on the relationship between your prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, and the emotional centers, which are in the midbrain.
Hmm.
And that can be tuned. My new book, Why We Meditate,
Hmm.
speaks to that because I think meditation is a way of tuning that. The second thing that's little understood is that empathy is not one thing. There's three kinds of empathy. One is cognitive. I understand how you think, how the mental models you use to divide the world and
Hmm.
explain it to yourself.
Hmm.
That's one kind of empathy. But another kind is emotional empathy, feeling what someone else feels. It's different. And
Hmm.
they depend on different circuits in the brain. And the third kind of empathy uh, is different from both of those. It's called technically empathic concern. It
Hmm.
means you care about the
Hmm.
person
Hmm.
because you could be very good at cognitive empathy and very good at emotional empathy, but if you're a narcissistic sociopath, you don't care about the other person. You want to manipulate them for your own ends.
Hmm.
So I think all three are really, really important.
Is EQ a concept that is equally well understood by, younger, like teens or even grade school students, or is it something that you really
Oh,
can't appreciate until you become an adult of some kind?
I think it's never too early to help kids understand that this kind of intelligence matters. For example, when your kid comes home from school,
Yeah,
the typical question is, how'd you do on the exam?
right.
But an EQ question might be, who was kind to you today?
Mm,
That's a completely different way
mm,
of thinking
mm,
about the school
mm,
day. And in fact,
mm,
I've long been an advocate of what's called social emotional learning, which are
mm,
programs in essentially in emotional intelligence, but for school
mm,
kids. And they're integrated into the schools. I don't know if they are where you
mm,
live, Richard. You
mm.
say you're in the San Francisco Bay Area,
Yeah, yeah.
in San Francisco or down the peninsula or where?
In San Francisco.
San Francisco.
Yeah, yeah.
I think some of the schools there do this.
Hmm.
And it's called, dozens of different things, but essentially you're helping kids heighten their self-awareness, their awareness of their emotional life, and how to handle troubling emotions. In fact, I'll tell you a story. It's an SEL story. 5-year-old boy, this is in the snowy Northeast. You have to imagine that being in San Francisco. Snowy day. He says to his mom, "Mom, can I go out and play?" And she says, "Sure, but you got to put your snowsuit on And at that, he has a tantrum. He's kicking the floor. He says, no, I won't do it. I won't do it. And then all of a sudden, he stops, goes to his room, stays there a few minutes, comes back with his snowsuit on, goes out to play. And his mom says, hey, what just happened? And he says, oh, well, my guard dog got upset, so I had my wise owl talk to it. And that is neuroscience for a 5-year-old. He's talking about the guard dog is the emotional centers, particularly the amygdala, and the wise owl is the prefrontal cortex. And what he's doing is working on strengthening that ability, which, as I pointed out earlier, is absolutely essential to managing your own inner life. And that's the kind of thing they learn in social emotional learning programs. And it's age appropriate. They might teach the same lesson in different ways as kids are able cognitively and emotionally to understand it more deeply. And they cover the spectrum. And it turns out critical to that is having it done well. The teachers who are doing this embody it. Because if they don't, if it's just another lesson, kids aren't going to really get it.
When you first published the book, Emotional Intelligence, I mean, that term was not widely known or widely understood. Was there something, was there like an event that really kind of made that take off? Or, I mean, was it instantly a hit or what happened?
You might remember the context of those days. There was a book on IQ, which was a bestseller.
Oh, yeah.
Which said, it was by Richard Herrnstein and I forget the other guy. Herrnstein was a professor at Harvard when I was there. And anyway, what it argued was that your IQ is what matters. And that's it. And if you're lucky enough to have a high IQ, good for you. You're probably one of the people reading our book. It was a little smug and arrogant, I thought, but basically it was in praise of IQ. So when emotional intelligence came along, it was in a sense a rebuttal to that way of thinking, or at least a modification. Because it's not that IQ doesn't matter, of course it matters, but both are important. They just matter in different ways.
What did your editor say when was your editor surprised at how well the book did? Usually editors are not. Was he surprised?
My editor was a woman, a very talented woman, who probably was shocked as I was that it became a bestseller for like a year and a half on the New York Times list. Nobody expected that, nobody. And actually, over that year, I started doing a lot of talks, going to companies and so on, and lecturing about emotional intelligence, what it was, why it mattered. Now I have a whole new batch of data to talk about because of this new book, but it turned out for a year I didn't write anything for the New York Times. Then they noticed and they suggested that maybe I didn't really need to be there anymore. So
well, give me a range of the people that you've, either consulted with or taught. I mean, I assume you've taught with, you've met with tons of CEOs and Fortune 50 companies. I mean, give me a kind of a range of who you worked with in your illustrious career.
Back in those days, I remember I was at Goldman Sachs, for example, back when it was a different kind of company. It wasn't a bank then. I was at Google. I was at, you name it, I may have been there. The truth is that I've probably gone to a couple hundred companies, which I don't really remember very well. They all kind of merge.
Yeah, right, of course. Yeah. Is emotional intelligence something that, is it something that you can understand very quickly, but it's very hard to master? Or is it something that you can actually, do something about very quickly? Tell me a little bit about the learning curve of
I think that learning about emotional intelligence, the concept of emotional intelligence is good, but it's definitely not sufficient.
Yeah, right.
If you're going to learn, if you're going to master the skill of empathy, if you're going to get better at handling your anger, it takes a lot of practice. And the reason is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the understanding the brain strengthens the circuitry that you use more often. So when you practice your golf stroke, you're taking advantage of neuroplasticity. When you practice any of these things. So I've just actually started offering an online program in emotional intelligence to help people go through the process piece by piece of each aspect that matters of emotional intelligence, and getting to know what it means and starting to apply it in your life, at your work, if you're a leader in your leadership, if you're in a couple, or if you're a dad or a mom. I mean, you can apply it anywhere, but practicing over and over so that it becomes better and better. So there is this Daniel Goleman emotional intelligence program now. After all these years, I decided maybe I should do that, because there's hundreds of other programs out there, some of which might be good, some not. Yeah.
Is the stuff the stuff you the emotional intelligence stuff, is that also something that's been embraced by, you know, psychologists and psychotherapists to use? I mean, how has that been adapted or adopted by that community?
Well, actually, the biggest adoption is in graduate training, in medicine, in counseling, in education, in business. I keep running into people say, "Oh, I read your book in graduate school," because I was assigned the book. And psychotherapy is, you know, I was trained as a psychotherapist initially. Psychotherapy is a loose amalgam of dozens of different schools of therapy, some of which may use emotional intelligence as a map. It's really a model of emotional well-being. But most psychotherapy focuses on psychopathology, helping people who are chronically anxious, for example, or obsessive, or whatever the particular presenting problem might be, eating disorders. And one of the more popular movements within therapy is not emotional intelligence, it's the combination of mindfulness with cognitive therapy. My wife, Tara Bennett Goldman, was a pioneer in putting those two things together. She wrote a book, Emotional Alchemy, which I think is much more useful than emotional intelligence, but that's just my take.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about the most recent book you wrote, Why We Meditate, and how you got kind of how you got interested in meditation. I'm actually a little bit of a student of meditation myself. I was very moved by Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now. I mean, I really was moved by that book. And it really had a very transformative effect on a lot of what I was thinking, and I've, you know, been studying some meditation. So I'm curious to know how your journey in meditation came about.
Sure. Well, I started meditation when I was in college, because I was really anxious and it helped me calm down and focus. Then I got into what's called Vipassana, or insight, or meditation, or mindfulness. And I got very intrigued by all of the interesting states of mind I could get into, and the presence, as Eckhart talks about. And then I segued from there to Tibetan studies, which I found were even more sophisticated. You know, Tibet as a culture kind of saved a kind of vast storehouse of understanding of the mind and how to work with it for centuries and centuries. And now it's kind of opening to the world at large. So I wrote Why We Meditate with a teacher of mine who's Tibetan. He's Tsoknyi Rinpoche, he's a Tibetan Lama. And he talks about, from a Tibetan point of view, what are the practices and why they matter. And then I come in with the science and say, well, what science says about it. Because I've just written a book before that with a neuroscientist at Wisconsin, a friend of mine named Richard Davidson, reviewing all the best studies of meditation. And what do you know? There's a dose-response relationship. The more you practice, the better the benefits. And the benefits are pretty remarkable at the high end, but they start right from the beginning. As you may have found, I don't know what you practiced or what you practice today, Richard, but if you do mindfulness, if you focus on your breath, you immediately get calmer, you immediately get better concentration, because that's what you're training the brain to do. And it goes on and on, depending on what you do. If you do a compassion meditation, guess what? You get more compassionate. More likely to help people out, and so on. So, and Why We Meditate, it's a stepwise progression, starting with very simple methods and going to more and more, I won't say complex, but I would say advanced. And then I back that up with science.
Now, have you been doing meditation your whole life then, or is this something it says you did it early, then did you pick it up later? Tell me a little about that.
I think I've been meditating my adult life from college
Yeah.
on,
Okay.
but I would say that my motivation changed,
Mm.
particularly. So beginning, it was just like, I'd like to be more focused and less anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a junior in college.
Yeah.
Then later it was, this is really interesting, understanding the mind in this way. And seeing that you can change your relationship to your thoughts and your emotions.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be caught up in them and swept away,
Yeah.
but rather you can just note them at a distance and let
Yeah.
them come and let them go.
Yeah.
And then that opens the door to other kinds of inner experience. And then I met a lot of Tibetan lamas who I thought were really admirable human beings. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll see what I can do there. And maybe one day when I grow up, I'll be somewhat like those people. So that's where I've ended up. So I would say the motivation matters and it changes, but I don't think that motivation matters that much for what you do and the benefit you get, because I think the benefits start from the beginning.
Yeah. Well, the thing about meditation is interesting. I mean, there's so many things about that. I mean, I assume you know Joseph Goldstein, who obviously is very well known in meditation.
Sure.
And the thing about meditation is, on one hand, it seems super easy, and yet it's very, you can obviously spend a lifetime studying it. I mean, on one hand, focusing just on your breath seems like the easiest thing one can do, and yet obviously it's very, it's very complex. So that's one of the, more interesting things about meditation, I think.
So you mentioned Joseph Goldstein. I met Joseph in Bodh Gaya, India in I don't know when, 72, 73. He's been a friend for a long time.
Yeah.
And he was studying meditation in Asia so he could bring it back to America, which is what he did.
Yeah, right.
He was one of the first teachers of what we now call mindfulness, but really as you point out, it's a much more intricate system.
Yeah.
It's an insight meditation system, and there are different stages and different steps. And he's a master of all of them.
Yeah.
But it starts with mindfulness, and many people, for example, in the Bay Area, many companies are doing mindfulness. They're just on their own.
Yeah.
And I am all in favor of it because the benefits are great.
Yeah.
So, it turns out that that's a great beginning. You could stay there or you could go on. And if you go on, you might do a retreat where you're meditating all day for 7 days or 10 days. Yeah. And that gets you into even more interesting spaces. I don't know if you've ever done that, Richard, but you might know people who have. Spirit Rock in the Bay Area, the place where a lot of people go. Yeah. And Spirit Rock was founded by Jack Kornfield, who's another old friend of mine, by the way.
I personally use the Waking Up app by Sam Harris. Do you know Sam Harris is also very big into meditation? So
so Sam and I and Joseph and Sharon Salzberg went to Nepal in the 90s to study with the Tibetan Lama. And then Sam became famous for being a brilliant iconoclast. And then he started an app. What's it called?
Waking Up.
Waking Up, and it's an excellent app, and he's put together his own synthesis of different meditation methods he picked up, but it's mostly within the framework ultimately of what's called Dzogchen. So the lamas, like Sokni Rinpoche, there's a lama who teaches that same method. Sam and his app, I think, are really good. There's another one by a different Harris, Dan Harris.
Yes, I know that one too.
10% Happier.
Yeah, right.
Where Joseph is on that app. A lot of good teachers are on that app. And, if you can't take the time to go to a retreat, get an app. Why not?
Yeah, totally. Well, tell me a little bit about the intersection of meditation and emotional intelligence. I mean, what is the intersection of those two?
Well, I see meditation is a great way to up your emotional intelligence, because the foundation of emotional intelligence, remember, is self-awareness.
Yes.
And meditation is nothing but tuning into your inner life, to becoming self-aware and changing your relationship to your inner life so you become more self-aware. That gives you a foundation for managing your upsets, your impulses, your disruptive emotions. And it also turns out that the more aware you are of your own inner life, the more aware you can be of someone else, the more empathic you can be, the wider the range of cues and signals you'll pick up. And then, as I said before, you put that all together to have effective relationships and emotional intelligence. So I think that meditation is a wonderful basis for working on emotional intelligence.
Have you yourself done a meditation retreat? I assume you have.
Many.
Many, yes, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find them the greatest vacation because, you know, you can be on a beach in Maui just worrying about this or that, just like you were at home. But on a retreat, you free your mind of that stuff.
I don't know if you, the most power, the way I kind of stumbled into it was, as I said, I read The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, and I was, the way I actually, he has a very powerful introduction where he explains how he discovered this concept. And he said it came from a very short phrase. He was sitting one day and he was terribly depressed and anxious and just his whole life was, you know, at rock bottom. And he said to himself, he said, I can't stand living with myself. And that one sentence made him realize that the I and then myself can be separated into two different things. And that really, but that just because prior to that point, I had never thought that I could be separate from my thoughts. I thought I was my thoughts. I thought, and that's when you feel so out of control because you feel like your thoughts control you. You know, you're completely out of control. But when you realize you can be separate from your thoughts, that is just mind-blowing. I mean, so powerful.
And in fact, that's one of the great gifts, I think, of looking in of meditation, is you see that your thoughts and your feelings come and go instead of buying into them. Ordinary, you know, in ordinary consciousness, whatever we feel, whatever we think is what takes us over. That's who we are. That's who we identify with. But Soni Rinpoche calls that a kind of reified self. But he says there's an essence self which just sees that whole melodrama come and go, come and go, and come and go. And that is extremely freeing, don't you think?
No, I think so. It really is. I mean, it's just, I mean, the idea that you can be in control of your mind and not the other way around. Is really powerful because so many of us just feel like, you know, we can't control our thoughts. It's like a runaway. I mean, our thoughts can be like a runaway freight train, and you feel like, you know, you're not in control. This thing is going at 100 miles an hour right off a cliff.
It's not that you control your thoughts; they just keep coming and coming. What you change is your relationship to thoughts.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
So that you don't jump onto every train that comes by.
Yes, totally.
You just say, oh, well, there's that train, and here's another train, and there's another train. And there it goes.
Yes. And also, now I can kind of see that train when it's going at 20 miles an hour instead of being trapped on it when it's going 100 miles an hour, which is what I used to be. You know? The thing's 100 miles an hour and you're on it and you think you're just doing it. But now I can, it's like, okay, I see it coming. I can kind of, you know, but it's only going at 20 miles an hour. So it's a much more, you know, you can deal with it much better.
Yes. And I think that is one of the greatest gifts that you can give yourself.
Yeah, totally.
Is the ability to let go.
Yeah, totally.
To let it go and let it go. The first method that Soni Rinpoche teaches, you might be interested in, is a way to experience that immediately. It's called dropping. You raise your arms. It's a physical thing. And you just let them drop onto your knees. And at that moment, whatever you're thinking stops. It gives you a glimpse of that. And it's like, no matter how important that thought was to you, as you were thinking it, you immediately see, who cares? That is, it's just a thought. And from that little glimpse into that gap can be expanded. That's what, I don't know if Sam Harris talks about it, but definitely in the Dzogchen meditation, they say, having short sessions, that's like a short session, the way they see it, many times is the way to keep working on this. And by the way, this is really interesting. In the Tibetan view, a session of meditation is not the time you're sitting on your cushion or closing your eyes or whatever you do. It's the time that you're not lost in your thoughts. That's the real session. And you may be sitting on your zafu, lost in thought, and never have a session in that sense. Or you can have a session in the middle of the day, in the middle of doing something else.
One of the things Sam Harris does talk about, and I've also observed this, and it's so interesting, is that why the mind needs to repeat itself so much. I mean, if something bad happens or you have a piece of bad news, well, you know it happened. It was bad news, but somehow the mind feels it needs to repeat itself constantly. And one of the things he talks about, and he says this, but it's sort of true, is that, if we spoke out loud every time we got these thoughts, we would sound like a crazy person. I mean, we're just repeating ourselves over and over and over again. And but that's the way our mind works. It's very interesting.
There's an evolutionary explanation of that too. I don't know if Sam talks about it, but in evolutionary psychology, the fact that the brain tends to obsess about negative things. The down things, and really not to pay much attention to the up things, was a survival mechanism. It was a way of reminding ourselves in prehistory of danger and of the thing that you don't want to do again, or you want to be wary around. And now we live with this habit when it really doesn't serve us at all. It's the basis of anxiety. It's the basis of rumination. Rumination is thinking all over and over again about something that's upsetting. And it's not a healthy kind of anxiety. A healthy anxiety is you think of something that's worrisome, and then you think about what you could do to prepare, and then you drop it. That's helpful. But if you keep coming back to it, as you're saying, Richard, over and over again, then, oh my God, then you're anxious. So meditate, as I said, that was my first motivation for meditation, was to learn how to just drop it.
Interesting. How much time do you meditate every day now in your normal practice? What is your meditation practice?
Well, Richard, I have to ask you, which standard are you using? The time I tell myself is a meditation session, or the time I'm actually free of thought?
Well, tell me describe both to me.
I would say that I like to have maybe an hour of meditation a day, start my day that way. Whether the day allows it or not is different. I'd like to do a retreat where I did that many hours a day. I find that a treat, not just a retreat. And within that hour, maybe I'll actually be in a space where I'm letting go some of the time, not all the time, but I lose track of time, so I can't tell you, this percent or that percent. And I know for sure it's not all of the time.
Of course. But then also throughout the day, I assume you're constantly employing meditation techniques, almost like micro-meditation, right? Because every time you're consumed with a thought, or you're applying those techniques to prevent yourself from getting taken over by your thoughts as well, I take it.
I wish it were true, Richard. I would say this. I remember I mentioned the dose-response relationship. I would say the more recently I've done a retreat where I became very strong in that kind of habit, the more often I would remember during the day to do it too.
Right. Yeah.
In fact, I'm going to do a retreat between Christmas and New Year's.
I see. Yeah. Well, it seems like in these days it's becoming even more important because, the minute you wake up, you're immediately, not only do you have your own thoughts, just immediately just an enclave, but now, of course, we have our phones, which just add to it, so, I mean, you can barely even wake up without, this onslaught of thoughts that just,
That's right.
just bowl you over. And it's really incredible. I mean, the minute you're conscious, you're immediately swept over, there's no relief at all.
There's a saying in cognitive science that attention consumes information, but a wealth of information means a poverty of attention. That is to say, we get about at least five times more information now than was true 20 years ago, before we all had phones to look at in the morning.
Yeah.
And that means that cultivating attention, which is what every kind of meditation does, is more and more important. I think, it amazes me that we don't teach this to kids in school, because the more they can pay attention to what the teacher says or the lessons, the better they'll learn. But we ignore it. This culture ignores attention because we depend on novelty, on something new. Here's the news. It's interesting that the word new is at the heart of news. Here's what's new. Pay attention to that, because your brain is going to perk up. That's what the brain does when it sees something new and novel. So we have new designs every season. We have new cars. Basically, it's the same thing, but it's just made to look a little different and improved a little bit. And our economy is based on this facet of neural function, which is. But if we were to cultivate attention instead, then we would free ourselves from being hooked on the novel, and the news.
Well, Daniel, this has been a wonderful conversation. Meditation is one of my all-time favorite topics. And it was so nice to talk to somebody who's so knowledgeable and has studied it. And I love how you combine that with your, emotional intelligence work. It's really terrific. And I'd love to invite you back in a few years and share with me other things you've learned.
I'd love to do it, Richard. I hope to see you again. Thanks so much.
This is Richard Hsu and Daniel Goleman. Thanks.